I'm going to talk today about a thing called RMAP and what it is and why it's important to us. RMAP is the Regional Transportation, Regional Mobility and Access Plan called RMAP. And it's the regional long range transportation plan for each eastern Pima County. It projects plans and costs for all transportation issues for 30 years, though it gets revised every 5. RMEP is actually mandated by federal law, and it relies on a single population projection from the Arizona Department of Administration, which and all planning in Tucson and the state is done with this single number. RMAP defines everything that is officially planned for transportation for decades in the future and specifies how much money it will cost. The full completion of RMAP over 30 years is estimated to be $32 billion, and half of it is funded. The other half is called unfunded, and they don't know where the money is coming from. The plan RTA next vote in next year or the year after is part of an effort to raise the other half. So what are the elements that make up RMAP? Well, they're the things like build more roads, maintain roads, build and operate the transit system, bike and pedestrian facilities, and all those same things at the local level where the city or the county individually have all the funds they need to do it with. Those funded things add up to a total of over $17 billion. But that's actually only half RMAP, because another $15 billion is those same categories, but add up to $15 billion, but they don't know where the money's coming from. So in the case of building more roads, there's $6.6 billion of unfunded road projects and $6.6 billion of unfunded transit projects, mostly in the form of the capital infrastructure to actually create greater capacity. That adds up to 15 billion. This is another way of looking at the same thing, except in reality, they no longer think they have $17 billion in an update at the end of last year. They've now reduced their anticipated revenue to $15 billion. But they're still keeping all the projects that they have before. You can see with the yellow and the orange colored slices of the pies, on the left is what's funded. On the right is what's not funded, and those two pies are basically the same size. So there are actually more unfunded transit and more unfunded roads than are expected to be funded. If nothing changes, my assessment is we're basically planning on failure. If failure means no change in what we're doing in the way of serving Tucson. The 84% of all trips are currently done by car, and 25 years from now, they're expecting essentially the same thing. Slight decrease, maybe in 25 years. But the reality is, unless we change the physical layout of the city and create much more shade and beauty for all Tucsonans, these predictions are probably about accurate. And the basic reason is that the average distance between each of us and what we want to get to at that time is nearly 6 miles for every single trip that people take. That's far too much for most people to be willing to walk or even bike. So where's the money for all this coming from? Well, it's actually not all that easy to figure out. There's so many different pots of money, and they get sliced and diced in many different ways. The surrealist spaghetti plate on the left there is the allocation process for one of the major funding sources, a thing called HERF, Highway User Revenue Funds. That's made up of gas taxes, diesel taxes, vehicle license taxes, registration fees, and a couple of other things. Collectively, it's something like $1.5 billion a year statewide, and Tucson region gets approximately 500 million. HERF is nearly 200 million of that. Also, there's the RTA, which isn't shown on any of these pie charts, but that's another 100 million a year. Considerably more, in fact, than this direct state and federal monies. A few factoids of interest: only a quarter of new county roads are paid for with impact fees. The $15 billion shortfall would cost every Tucsonan $600 a person a year for the next 25 years. The gas tax purchasing power has been cut in half in the last 30 years, and Biden is asking for new car production to be 50% electric within the next 9 years. And lo and behold, here's what it looks like. In 1990, as the base, by a couple of years ago, the value of the gas tax in purchasing power had been cut in half. That's the graph on the left. The graph on the right is driving continued to increase for decades, but the fuel consumption has essentially leveled off because of increasing efficiency. So you get less revenue per mile, and it's worth less when you have to buy stuff. And on top, electric vehicles could make a 20% difference in, could become as much as 20% of the entire vehicle fleet by 2030, and that would cut gas taxes still further. There's one more key thing you need to know in order to understand the structure of the transportation system. That's what I call the one number to rule them all. That's the official population projection of the Arizona Department of Administration. It's used directly or indirectly to turn and the amount of growth is planned for years and decades ahead. We use it to plan and fund all public infrastructure investments for decades at a time. But by law, policy, and culture, this is the only number that's allowed to be used for official infrastructure planning purposes throughout the state of Arizona. It determines everything that is done to plan for future increases in population, though the distribution of that population is determined locally. And those population projections have always been wrong. Years ago, I was given a database of 20 official population projections done for Pima County over the last 40 or 50 years. The blue line is the projected percentage increase in population made by each of those predictions. And you can see there's just general downward trend for the last 50 years. But the green line is the actual growth rate of Tucson. And it's consistently lower for the entire period of time. There were 13 population projections that made a prediction for the year 2020, and everyone was wrong and everyone was high. And while two of them got within 50,000 people, the others were off by 150 to 500,000 people over by the year 2020. So we've been planning for basically as much population growth as we could justify, and that has determined all of our policies about how much money we need to spend and what we need to spend it on. So the basic question is, can we have a sustainable transportation system? The real question is, can we afford to create the access to the needs, to the things that are important to us, and save billions of dollars in the process? To answer that question, you need to know two terms. Generated traffic and induced travel is one idea. It's the semi-permanent increase in traffic volumes that are generated by the temporary addition of additional road capacity. The phrase, build it and we will drive, pretty much fits what's happening. It's caused by a couple of things. If you make one transportation corridor better temporarily, traffic from other more congested roads will drift over to take advantage of the better conditions. And also, over time, people move or they change jobs. And if the road is temporarily better, faster, then they will, on average, look farther away for opportunities than they were willing to before, and people will start to take those more distant advantage of opportunities process to create more travel. And that's called induced travel. The other term that's important is, I'm sure you've never heard of this one because I named it. It's a mobility diet. It's the strategic remodeling of neighborhoods and commercial areas to improve our access to more nearby services and opportunities, and to reduce the amount of forced mobility and its attendant costs. One thing I learned when I was co-chairing the regional transportation plan in the mid 80s, our top staff person told me that every time you build $1 billion of more roads, you get 10 times that much in additional driving over a 25-year period because of this generated traffic and induced travel. So it's you don't normally get much out of building additional capacity because it tends to fill up because of what it generates itself. But this alternative idea of a mobility diet is not familiar to people. So what are some of the tools that would make up such a toolkit? And I would start with great traffic calming and lots of rainwater trees. The first thing you want to do with a mobility diet is to make people's neighborhoods so nice and so safe and so interesting that they're willing to get out and walk or bike for any purpose. Doesn't matter what. And the key element to actually accomplishing that is just to make our neighborhoods better. Second key thing is to develop a relocation plan and then actually implement it so that you encourage about 8 or 10 different kinds of businesses to move closer to their customers. So you've got grocery stores, drug stores, hardware stores, daycare, car repair, and quite a few restaurants, banks, and all of these things are the economy currently supports at least 60 of, but they're not necessarily located close to their customers. So that's a second piece. A third one is if you've made great neighborhoods and encouraged those businesses to move closer to their customers in what I call urban village centers, then you have the potential to have people want to walk or bike there because they're close by. That's when you get lots of people trying to cross large streets. So you need to invest in your short trip infrastructure. Another element is after you've gotten people to the village center, many of them will want to go on to something else. So connecting those village centers with a great bus rapid transit system is an effective way to move large numbers of people without them having to get involved with their car. A key thing at this point is that you just persuaded my renter as a property owner, you just persuaded my renter to move someplace else. I'm not going to like that. So the politics of this is likely to be very dicey, and it's critical that we have a plan to actually repurpose those old buildings, either for light manufacturing or indoor food production, or things that would directly serve the immediate neighborhood. Another piece is home delivery service, because in reality, the car doesn't just carry me, it carries my packages as well. So what would something like that look like? Well, 60 urban village centers puts a village center within a mile or a mile and a half of everyone in Tucson. That would allow us to make everyone in Tucson have easy access to great transit service and many of the things that they're going to likely use on a regular basis. So that's one of the things. We can plant literally millions of rainwater trees throughout our neighborhoods in chicanes, pocket parks, and diagonal pocket parks as well. These are a set of tools that are available to us. So can Tucson have a sustainable access plan as opposed to a transportation plan? We need to focus on serving people and connecting them to the things they need and want, not to making them more mobile. We need to make our neighborhoods beautiful, safe, shaded, and fun. Encourage businesses to move closer to their customers, and provide great support for bus riders, bikers, and walkers. What we really need is an untransport plan.
You may be wondering how streets fit into watershed management, water conservation, green infrastructure. We'll get to that. So everybody I just had a board member this morning, when they saw me, they asked, what are you presenting on? I'm like, alternative transportation. And we're like, how does that fit with what we do? And I'm like, well, let me tell you. So we'll get into that here shortly. Great, thank you very much. I'm gonna start sharing my screen, move around some of my controls so I can see everybody. Awesome. And I will assume Kevin or Stuart, you'll be able to help monitor the chat, as sometimes it's hard to catch things that come through the chat. I'm happy to take questions as we go, keep this as interactive as possible. Knowing that we also have a timeline and a schedule to keep to make sure we get to that break, so we don't become Zoom zombies. So the session today, hopefully I got this right, connecting to sustainable mobility. And my subtitle is, or why electric vehicles are not the solution. So we'll get into that as well. We're gonna try to cover all of this, but hopefully my goal for the end of the session is to leave you inspired to take action, whether it's engaging someone in the use of sustainable modes of transportation, increasing the usage yourself, participation, becoming a choice rider over public transit, and potentially even advocating to mayor and council, the regional transportation authority, your elected Pima County supervisors, and beyond up to the federal level, as it's all connected. So was everybody able to access the Zoom board, the Jam board? Thumbs up. Anybody not able to access?
I was not able to.
Okay, and was that a permissions issue, or are you on a device that you're not linking to?
I've just been sick and haven't had the time to try it, so sorry about that.
Okay. Well, I will continue to share my screen. If you're able to see my screen, is it Danya?
Yes, thank you.
Okay. So it does get a little confusing when I'm sharing my screen and you're using the Jamboard, as you will not be able to write on my screen, but you can. So I'll just kind of give you a quick background. We do have multiple slides. So my first question of the session is, of your weekly trips to work, school, errands, for fun, how many of you use alternative modes of transportation, not a personal vehicle? So the way we can respond is I like to use the sticky note. And so you can see it puts up a sticky note prompt, and I will say, every day I ride my bike. The cool thing about this is it's fairly anonymous as long as you're not screen sharing. So it makes it where there's no judgment. This is all a room where we can learn, grow, and become stimulated. So feel free to use that sticky note option. And just so you're not confused, I will stop screen sharing just for the moment to make sure that you're trying to put a sticky note on the actual Jamboard. And if anybody's struggling with this, please let me know. Thank you very much, Danya, for communicating that. I'll start screen sharing in a moment so you can see.
Okay, so Catlow, we're going to start making our entries on the Jamboard now.
Yep. And then I would suggest that as you create that sticky note, just move it to the side, because unfortunately, all of the sticky notes get created in the same place, so they start to overlap each other. Great. So we're saying I walk, ride my bike one day for transportation purposes. One person is sad because they are not using alternative modes. Well, maybe we can shift that. I ride my bike to the gym 4 days a week. That's awesome. You're going to work out as you go to the gym. Ride my bike to work, and I walk every day. Sweet. I ride my bike on the loop to and from work. Oh, what a sweet commute. I love that. Sometimes I walk to the store, but should do more. And as Trace was just mentioning, sometimes those stores aren't located within a walkable or even a bikeable distance. Sometimes I walk to the store. Oh, sorry, I already read that one. I don't use alternative modes, but I need to. I like how you're starting to organize to where we have the sad, but folks that are wanting to use alternative transportation to the right. We have more of the folks that are already using it to the left. And feel free to enlarge it if you're writing a lot. I see one that just got added. I walk to nearby facilities, post office, groceries, used to take the bus to the school. I've stopped due to buses being, COVID riskier. Can't wait to start again. Nice, I like that. All right. So I am going to start screen sharing again. Thank you all for participating. Did anybody not able? Looks like we almost have the same number of sticky notes as participants. Does that sound right? Thumbs up from everybody, or feel free to unmute. Sweet, I love. I struggle in the Zoom environment when all I see are names. So thank you all for being responsive. And I understand if you may not have a strong enough connection to be able to have your video on. I totally understand that. Let me go into presentation mode. So a little bit about me. Kevin, you read a very long and lengthy, so I'll keep this short intro bio about myself. But this is more pictorial. This is me. This is how I choose to travel. I love riding my bike. I love getting others to ride their bikes along with me. I love doing bike gangs. It's so much more fun. I have started to use the bus again. Buses do require masks, so I feel, as a vaccinated person, I feel relatively safe on the bus. I've never not had an issue yet. And oftentimes I'm finding that the buses are fairly empty. So this is my wife and I taking a bus in Santa Fe, and we're like, oh, we're the only ones. And the bus was free. And we're like, this is great. So often, not just here at home, my wife and I both do not own a vehicle. So we have lived without a vehicle for about 5 years. That's by choice. We are privileged. I do have to recognize that, to be able to make that choice. Not everybody is. So we try to carry that also pre-COVID, when we used to travel for vacation, we'd bring along our folding bikes and we would bike around instead of renting a car. It makes it really easy to get on crowded ferries with your bike. There's always room for a bike, not always a car. Going by bus, by train, it gets you to be able to relax, enjoy the scenery, connect with others, rather than being isolated in your car. And then oftentimes, this picture on the left is Hong Kong. Hong Kong is so walkable. As we had a 12-hour layover in Hong Kong, we checked out of the airport and just took the transit downtown. And all of a sudden we found ourselves in the forest in the middle of this major city. It was amazing. To then even going on hiking and trekking trips, especially in the rural areas, and enjoying connecting to the landscape and the people through that. So I always like to frame this, we need to think about what is our impact of driving, and then we're going to get into some of the other issues that relate to the personal vehicle. So some of this you've probably heard, or you've seen different numbers. I don't want to really belabor this too much. I don't get into the stats, but for some people it's kind of helpful. But looking at, a third of our US greenhouse gas emissions are from transportation. 91% of the energy used in transportation is from petroleum. We'll talk a little bit about that when we introduce electric vehicles. 53% of that is gasoline for cars. So that's really light, our personal vehicles, more or less. 6 to 9 tons of carbon dioxide for each average personal vehicle each year. That's an amazing amount of carbon dioxide being produced. Then I like to focus more on the savings, and this is actually what got me finally to commit to giving up my car. Is I did the finances and I realized I can save thousands of dollars a year by not owning a vehicle. So I don't pay insurance, I don't do maintenance. What else? May not have a loan, or if it's an older car, there's a lot more maintenance, the gas. And now I have so much more room in my yard for my bike storage, for growing things, etc. But so that's, I'm a person of privilege and I'm able to make this choice. So I also often like to think, and empathize with others in the community. And so I want to take a moment and have another interactive session with the Jamboard. We're going to switch to slide 2. But I want us to all kind of take a moment, reflect, pause, and think of someone who does not have the ability or access to a personal vehicle. So what challenges do they face in accessing stores, groceries, work, errands, etc.? And if you're struggling with thinking about someone, just a few cues. Anybody under the age of 16 doesn't have the ability to drive. Anybody that's elderly that may have a vision impairment may not be able to drive. Many disabled folks in our community are unable to drive. Many of those without the financial resources may not have access to a personal vehicle. So it kind of really opens up who has that. So I'm going to switch from presentation mode to our Jamboard. And so I'd like to make sure that we're putting our notes on slide 2, just so they don't get mixed up. It looks like there was a few more that came in on slide 1, awesome. But we're gonna focus on slide 2. So connecting to resiliency, equity, environmental justice. So thinking of what challenges do they face? Oh, great, Danya, I just saw your note in the chat. You can access the Jamboard.
Catlow, I don't know if this helps, but up at the top, there's a thing that shows the page numbers, and that's how we select to get to the next slide.
Yes. Okay. Thank you, Stuart, for clarifying. Difficulty attending staff meetings at other locations. Don't have flexibility to accessing groceries, can't access groceries. or dependent on family and community to help access. Yeah, I was just meeting with, so I teach an alternative transportation session for Local First Arizona Scale Up program, and there was a, a pastor of a local church that has many parishioners that rely on friends or family to take them to church. So thinking about, you know, that's a huge comfort issue for somebody to go out and say, hey, I need help. And then how can we help make them potentially more independent? It's great that they have that community, but then they also feel that they're a burden if they don't have access to alternative modes of transportation. And then part of it is dignity. You know, we often stigmatize the bus system with being for homeless or for the poor. And so we as choice riders don't use it because we are intimidated, or we feel it's it is stigmatized. So I think part of it is giving dignity to those people that rely on the public bus and don't have that choice. And so how can we make them feel more comfortable too? Oh, and it looks like the sticky note doesn't work. Oh, let me stop screen sharing. Just make sure that you're accessing the Jamboard on your own, and then you should be able to use the sticky note option.
Yeah, I think I might be on the wrong Jamboard. Hold on.
Now I can reshare the link if needed.
Okay.
Let's see what else they have. To ask others to help, reliant on others, limited access. This is great. So I want to shift and start thinking about how can you in your capacity help increase mobility access for that person. And this is what drives me with thinking about promoting sustainable transportation. And I'm really grateful that the Complete Streets Coordinating Council that was formed for the city of Tucson is really focused on the equity issues and has a fairly diverse set of advisors on that committee that represent all different sectors, mobility sectors of our community to ensure that we can all increase mobility access. So advocating, so who are we advocating to? Somebody want to make some suggestions of who we might advocate to? And feel free to unmute. Who am I advocating to?
It would be, I think one of the, like I bike on the loop every day, and I will admit, I don't want to get hit by a car. I am kind of scared to bike on the road if there's not like a median between the bike lane and the road. And I don't like to bike on the sidewalk either, because we know that more people do get hit on the sidewalk from people pulling out. So maybe advocating to city planners to say, we can build safer bike lanes, rather than just painting a line down the road and have that be designated as the bike lane. We can advocate that way.
That's excellent. And I'm seeing that right now. I actually just learned in a presentation last week that those sharrows that the city really liked to paint a few years ago, those are only for low volume, low speed roads under 10 miles an hour. Yet you see them everywhere. I was in Santa Fe. I spent 2 months in Santa Fe earlier this summer, and there were sharrows everywhere on 30+ mile an hour streets. I'm like, this is ridiculous. So yes, I think helping, the folks who like to bike but are concerned about safety, we need to ensure and better guarantee their safety. Thanks for sharing that. Installing a bike rack at work, that's awesome. Can ask if I can pick things up, offer to carpool, advocate to the county to allow e-bikes on the loop. Yeah, I think the county's being overwhelmed with e-bikes right now. They tried to draw a hard line a few years ago, and now there's e-bikes everywhere. I'm like, they're gonna have to change that policy. I object to the objective. We need to decrease forced mobility by making Tucson more convenient, accessible, and affordable. I'm curious if that person, if you may be willing to share your thoughts on that or clarify your point.
That's me, Catlow.
I thought it might be Tracy.
The problem is that we travel over 8 billion miles a year in Tucson, and we spend $5 billion a year to do it. That's too much. And I don't think we can afford to maintain the system that allows that. So
I agree.
instead of saying, how can we improve mobility, we need to say, how can we reduce the need for it?
Yeah. And I think you're getting at land use planning, and land use planning drives transportation. Unfortunately, we're not getting out in front of land use planning, and we're not getting out in front of transportation. So I see it as we need to hit all of the fronts. And if I didn't share this yet, but how it intersects with water is we're barely even touching on water use planning and how water affects land use and how land use affects transportation. It's a very vicious circle. And so I agree with you, but I also feel the need that within our neighborhoods, within those couple of miles, that's where we do the bulk of our travels, and we can start to make those choices and increase that mobility access. I know shifting myself to going without a car, I'm much more deliberate about the trips and the choices I make in the stores I visit, the restaurants I visit, where I go for groceries. I definitely have my bike bubble that I rarely venture out of. And so that has reduced my overall miles, but partly it's by not having the convenience of having a car. And the same with the bus. I have my few bus lines I regularly take, and most of the others I rarely, and it's often for work trips. But no, great point. Does anybody else, any ahas or anything they want to share before we move on?
I have a quick question for anybody that has the answer to this. So when we use delivery services like Amazon delivery services, does that impact our like carbon footprint, or, you know, like is it better for the environment to have things delivered to us than making individual trips out into different areas by having one designated delivery service? I'm just curious if anybody has the answer to that.
I love your thinking of the life cycle. Of it's not just your use, but then how you impact through other choices you make. I don't know. That's a great question.
Jack, my thought is that it's going to depend on whether the delivery is just to you or whether they can do multiple deliveries on the same trip. If you could do 3 to an area as opposed to 3 to 3 completely different places, you probably decrease the amount of travel. Otherwise, it'd be the same.
There's so many elements, and beyond my knowledge, I'll say that a longtime county supervisor's aide in Marin County asserted that all of the personal deliveries that people were getting to her town in Marin County, it was creating congestion and more pollution than if people would go out on thoughtful combined trips, because there are some people getting 8 deliveries a day to their house and that kind of thing. So none of us here have the answer. We're all very interested in knowing that answer.
But I love that you're thinking along those lines. I try to avoid Amazon myself more because I, as a supporter of Local First Arizona, try to support local businesses. And I do use Amazon, but try to make it very thoughtful and very sparingly. But yeah, thank you.
Catlow, I have another question about how you move about without a car. We have been without a car before, or we've been with just a motorcycle. And right now we've talked about being without a car because we are very fortunate where we live. We have a lot of stuff that we can access by foot or by bike. The only thing that just keeps the car for us right now here in Tucson is going to like campgrounds or national parks or things like that. And I'm so curious what you and your partner do, because maybe that's something that we could do too.
Yep, you hit it. So that's when I rent a car or I go with a friend. Yep. And during COVID, that was the biggest struggle. And so we made it a deliberate point that we rented a car once a month for a weekend to go camping, to go backpacking. And we did try during the cooler months. We will often bike to a trailhead, lock up our bikes and go backpacking or camping. And so we can do that here in the Tucson area, like in the lower range. We're not as crazy as about biking all the way up Mount Lemmon. So you do have to pick your battles. But we found that even with just renting a car once a month for a weekend, we still have a savings. And the other thing we found is the life cycle cost, and I'll get to this in an electric vehicle, is that to make an electric vehicle worthwhile, you have to run it into the ground because there's so much embodied energy just to produce that electrical. And if you're going to use it sparingly, whether it's gas or electric, then it's not ever going to overcome its life cycle costs. So that's where I think we really need to ramp up car sharing. There's so many extra cars in this community. When we first went car free, I had like 10 different friends say, we have an extra car parked we rarely use. But the trick is, I think that it's starting to get better about insurance and how insurance covers car shares. But that's something I'd like to learn more about. So that may be the future of car shares.
Wonderful, thank you.
Yeah, great question.
So
Sorry.
Anne had a question. Are you able now to do the sticky note, Anne, or is that still sticky for you?
No, I can't use it for, I don't know if I made a boo, but I just put something in, I just stuck something in chat.
Oh, thank you.
I've been using chat. No, I'm not, I don't see the sticky board. I just see all of our faces.
Oh, you have to enter it in a separate tab of your browser, the URL for the Jamboard.
I'm on my iPad. I think I have limitations. I don't have a computer with me.
Oh, okay.
So, but the first exercise I got onto the board, but I had either the board or people's faces. But no, I'm fine. I'll just stick stuff in.
Next time we go to the board, I'll share the link again, and maybe that will.
Okay,
prompt
thank you.
to be able to
Thank
open it. But thanks for sharing via chat. So you were saying I go out in the evening, I use Lyft to and from the house, or I carpool with friends and family. Yeah, evenings are difficult, especially because there's more safety and concern issues. So definitely understand that.
Yeah, I'm a little old to drive at night, I think so.
And Jessica wrote, I don't Uber, but I wonder if, I think that was the question that was just answered.
Yeah, I answered that question, yes.
Okay. And Kevin, you have a hand up, it looks like.
Yeah, I was thinking about car sharing, and I seem to remember back in the early mid-90s, there was a big push for car sharing, particularly in large metropolitan areas. A number of services were created. Some of it was funded with government money to kind of pilot and get the thing off the ground. And thinking of I lived in Chicago at the time, and I noticed the car sharing stations tended to be where the bus station route along the bus routes, or they were along where the L trains were. But then I realized a number of these car sharing programs got bought up by rental car companies, and I'm not sure what, if they've been able to sustain or not. I would think you have to kind of be strategic, I think, and you have to think about the marketing and know your audience pretty well. And because there are some barriers there to people thinking about, do I want to,
Yeah.
use another car on a regular basis, that can be a little bit scary for folks. Otherwise, I think when you, in some cities, and I noticed when I lived in Chicago, I had a car, but it was in the garage most of the time.
Yeah.
I was lucky enough I could walk to work,
Yeah.
but I was close to amenities. And but I think for people, there's a psychological barrier there with car sharing, maybe.
Yeah. I actually prefer renting a car. I never have to worry about a broken down car because they're always fairly new. So that's the plus side of me. I used to own a very dilapidated car that used to break down a lot and was always a point of concern. I'm gonna, just interest of time, I see there's another comment about carpooling and such, but I want to keep us moving. Thank you for sharing. Great discussion. So hopefully everybody can see my screen again. So I just want to kind of think about what are the impacts of our transportation and infrastructure and currently, and then start to look at how could we change that. And part of it is, there's a lot of issues around urban heat stress. And so I throw up this map with PAG's Green Infrastructure Prioritization Tool. You can find this if you just Google that. I plugged in or just put a star where WMG's Living Lab is along Speedway near Alvernon. Put in just a few other identifiers. The other stars, Elcon Mall, the U of A, the Santa Cruz River. And so the warmer the color, the hotter the surface temperature. The cooler the color means the cooler the temperature. So what we're seeing is there's definitely Reed Park is very cool. Elcon Mall is very hot. And that's because you're probably familiar with what causes urban heat stress, a lot of asphalt, concrete. But then look at where the pink dots are. And we can see that these are all bus stops. And look how warm it is along Speedway. So then we start to, well, I'll come back to that. So then not just heat stress, we have issues with, but all of this surface runoff. So this is where we start to get into the water conservation, green infrastructure side. When it rains, produces runoff, and all of that runoff becomes downstream flooding and is often carrying surface water pollutants and such. So not only do we have extreme heat, we have then chronic flooding combined that our transportation infrastructure largely drives. And so we try to get at this a little bit with green infrastructure, but it's an overwhelming problem. Now let's go back to that same map, but layer on heat vulnerable populations. So these are where, based on the Pima County's definition of a heat vulnerable population, we now can map these. So thinking about, somebody who may be without the financial resources to own a car, and is reliant on public transit. So they're walking or they're biking or they're walking to a bus stop. And you can see that these are the warmer communities and they're often accessing warmer transit stops. But this is just Midtown Tucson. Let's go a little bit further south into southern Tucson. So this is where it really starts to drive that equity issue, is look how warm is this map compared to that previous map. These colors are much cooler versus these colors. So it is much warmer, and that's largely because there's less tree canopy in southern Tucson. There's a lot more concrete, a lot more asphalt. You think the airport's helping with this? No, and not just heat, then contributing to flooding as well. So we can see a range of transportation issues. Maybe we can just call out a few. Feel free to unmute. What do you see wrong with this street in Midtown Tucson? This is Country Club. What's wrong with this?
No trees.
No trees. What else?
No
I don't see a bike lane.
I'm sorry.
I don't.
At a time.
Go ahead, Kevin.
I don't see a bike lane.
No bike lane. Great. Trace.
There are no destinations.
No destinations. Someone else.
It looks like there's no place for the water to run off.
And no storm drains. Yep.
Wow.
You've got sidewalks.
You were all catching more than I caught.
You've got sidewalks, but in this little stretch, there's hardly any way to even get to it.
You were breaking up a bit, but I think I heard no sidewalks.
Well, no, there's sidewalks.
Somebody who I haven't,
I was saying there's sidewalks, but no way to get to them.
yep. And I'm seeing a
It
few
looks like
come in
maybe-
through the chat, no shade cover, no bike lane, lots of concrete. And sorry, Kim, you were saying?
It looks like there's no, maybe not very much lighting. So if you were walking around at night, it might be kind of unsafe.
Yeah. Yeah, speeding traffic, no bus shelter, no sidewalk, not safe to bike, no access to nearby open space, no shade. All right, what about this neighborhood street in southern Tucson? Right along the Interstate 19. What's on the other side of that interstate? The Santa Cruz River, the loop. How does this resident access that? That's my issue. What are some other issues you see?
No trees. No shade.
trees.
That's the first thing I notice anywhere.
There-
No
there's
sidewalks.
There's no sense of space. It's just a wall, essentially. It's like a dead end of nothing.
There's a lot of whitewash from covering up graffiti. I think, Kim, you were about to say something?
I think I was just going to say no sidewalks. Like you said, there's no way for people to get around with just working, walking through the dirt, joyas and cactuses or whatever's out there.
And
Yeah.
the dirt will just run off into the street. There's nothing holding back the dirt from just running into the street when it rains.
Yeah, great
And
observation.
there's no place to cross the street, it doesn't look like.
Yeah, this is a residential street, so supposedly slower speeds, less volume, but yeah.
It's shockingly ugly for something that's right next to the Santa Cruz.
I know, totally. Like there could be amazing green space on this other side and this community has no access to it, completely cut off because of this interstate. So thinking about that as an environmental justice issue, and then thinking about vehicle noise, air pollution, there's no transit infrastructure. It's a paved over arroyo. This is actually an arroyo. These are storm drains that drain to the Santa Cruz River. So just upstream of that street, we did intervention, worked with New Hope, Nueva Esperanza Methodist Church. We put in a range of green infrastructure. We even found opportunities to put in rain basins and shade trees in their overwide parking lot. But what's the issue is we still have to accommodate for all those personal vehicles. So sure, we can do these small little retrofits, interventions, get people excited, but we haven't dealt with this bigger problem. And as Trace would like to continually remind us, we haven't dealt with the land use problem that drives this problem. So this is where everything is kind of interconnected. And this kind of relates to 40 to 60% of our urban areas for personal vehicles. This is Midtown Tucson. This star is our living lab, Alvernon Speedway, just to orient you. So I'm going to zoom in a little bit and look at how much space, this is our living lab, is dedicated to the personal vehicle. Those are our streets. Those are our driveways, parking areas. So what's wrong with this is our transportation infrastructure is driving this. And so it affects us not just out in the public sphere, it affects us at our home, it affects us at our business. We have parking minimums as a business. WMG was supposed to have 15 parking spaces based on our use. We got that down to 6, but we had to go through special processes. I'll talk about them in a little bit to incentivize alternative transportation. And most importantly, this isn't placemaking space. If you're an economist, you're like, oh, this is a huge loss of economic revenue. If you're an environmentalist, you're like, this is a huge loss of potential tree canopy or green space or places for urban nature. If you're an artist, it's a huge loss of potentially creative, artful space. And what's funny is when we travel, we love to visit those cities that have amazing alternative transportation modes, right? This is Amsterdam. And I was just sitting at this cafe enjoying a nice meal and watching people walk, bike, streetcars go by. It was amazing. And look how productive and vibrant it is. And this is in New Zealand. right before COVID hit. This was the very last trip. But we found this street where they had done a road diet to put in green infrastructure by narrowing, and they had these amazing shade trees. Outdoor dining, and how important is that now during time of COVID, right? We all feel much more safe being in an outdoor environment, eating and enjoying time with others. To then thinking about street side vendors in an outdoor environment. How do we support these small businesses to increase their usable space? And then most importantly is then thinking about our public spaces in a different way. It doesn't have to be dedicated to the personal vehicle. These should be placemaking spaces, places we can enjoy meeting neighbors, places we can feel comfortable being outdoors and not have speeding cars go by. Living Streets Alliance has been supporting and promoting streeteries and parklets. So again, outdoor dining, but essentially it's also making our communities that much more vibrant, facilitating connection between people. And I think of it as this, what's the space required to drive 100 people versus 100 people biking to taking a bus? So as we start to shift from personal vehicles to alternative modes, for me as a watershed planner, that means more permeable surfaces, more green infrastructure, more shade trees. And then maybe in some of those downtown, more economic areas, we can do more outdoor dining. And we're not just outdoor dining where we're on or facing a parking lot, but we're outdoor dining with shade trees nearby, with people walking by. That would be so much more fun. So this always, I like to ask the question, we went from equity to then how do we make these spaces more productive? So what would you like to use this extra public space for? And this is public space. This is your space. It's my space. It's not that driver's space. It doesn't have to be dedicated to that driver. So this is where I think it's really important that we all develop choice mobility participation, because the public transit system shouldn't be just for the underserved members of our community. It should be for everyone. And then what happens if we become a choice commuter is we increase investment in our public transit system, which makes it that much easier for somebody. We do have to be careful where those investments are made. We can have inequity in areas of our community where there's investments. So we need to make sure that we're also addressing equitable areas for investment. But I see it as we're not just choosing being a public transit rider, we're choosing community, we're choosing livability, we're choosing investment, we're choosing personal health, we're getting out, walking, biking more. And so a short case study about our own organization. We are a nonprofit here in Tucson. So feel free to visit our Living Lab Learning Center Monday through Friday, 9:30 to 5. We're open to the public. We're a nice little green space right next to a tire shop, a diesel shop, an underserved portion of the Palo Verde neighborhood. So we're kind of the only green space available. But everything we do, I already mentioned that we had a parking minimum set upon us. And so we got that whittled away so we could have more green space, more educational space. So that means that whenever we do events, the first thing we're doing is promoting, come visit us by alternative transportation. We actually have a 6-day water harvesting design certification coming up. We do a green infrastructure tour. Well, it's not just a tour driving around Tucson. We get people out on a bike. This is Brad Lancaster, who you may know of, leading that tour. And so getting people to experience the city in a new way. Sometimes it's people haven't ridden a bike for years. And the thing they remember the most about this course is we got them riding a bike and enjoying it. We have an intern docent training program, and that happens every fall each year. So this is where I was suggesting maybe we make this experiential. I did this for the first time because the bus is free right now. So I said, all right, instead of me just presenting on this, let's get on the bus. Let's go somewhere and let's see what we observe. Let's see how we feel. What did we experience? What did we notice? And we had that conversation. We went from our place to a nearby park a few miles away, had a conversation in the park, took the bus home. And then it inspired people to take action, to set goals, to be an advocate. For many, it was the first time they had ever ridden a bus, and they had felt intimidated to ride the bus because of the stigmas on our local bus system. And they found, hey, it's in a very inviting space, and there's nothing I should be fearful of. It's very clean. People were friendly. People were courteous, and they really enjoyed that experience. So here at WMG, we offer a bike benefit to all our employees. So full-time employees can get up to $400 a year, or part-time $200 a year for bike maintenance, helmets, whatever it may be. Prior to the bus being free, we offered everybody a bus pass. They could use anytime, for anything they wanted. It didn't have to be work related. Our whole thing was getting people comfortable in riding the bus more, encourage that. We do have a few other additional provisions. So we only reimburse mileage if they are commuting beyond 5 miles of our office. So we feel that within that 5 mile range, they should be walking, biking, or busing. And then, okay, that's a longer, maybe you're doing a project further out. Okay, we'll reimburse your mileage for that. We don't allow staff to use our parking space. It's for visitors only, especially since we only have 6 spaces. We do offer showers, we offer changing room, we offer bike maintenance supplies. We do have a loaner bike, and we often, prior to COVID and hopefully coming out of COVID, we do an annual alternative transport challenge. And it's not just for a few days, it's not just for a week. We try to make it month long because of that habit forming. It takes, what is it, on average 66 days to form a new habit. So we're often trying to address that. We have, again, COVID threw a wrench in things, but we have been tracking since 2016. And so, what is our carbon emission reduction by people taking the bus, to people taking the bike, to what are we saving per year based on our alternative transportation program. And I often, so when I did that experiential trip with our docents, interns, I had them plan the trip. I said, this is where we want to go. How do we get there? When do we catch the bus? Most people don't even know how to do that. Google Maps is extremely friendly. You can choose your mode of travel, set your destination, even set when you want to depart or arrive by, and it will tell you your options. So this is WMG, and I often have to go downtown for meetings. So do I do that by bus? About 30 minutes. By bike? About 20 minutes. Walking? Probably not realistic. Or driving. Oh, look, it's only 10 to 20 minutes. But let's back up. That's 10 to 20 minutes of being stuck in traffic, being stressed, trying to get to the meeting. That doesn't even include parking. So I have to park in a parking garage. I have to pay for that parking. Let's go back up to the bus. 32 minutes. What am I doing on that bus? I'm preparing for my meeting. I'm checking my email. I'm maybe taking some time to just relax, to clear my thoughts before I go into that meeting. I'm not stressed. So I think this kind of gets to, what can we do? What are the choices we can make? How do we make those choices differently? So we're going to go back to that Jamboard. I'll share that link. But we're going to look at what is within 3 to 4 miles of your home for grocery stores, workplace, park, gym, hardware stores, social, entertainment, amenities, other things. Use Google Maps. And we're going to put it on that Jamboard. So I'll go back to the Jamboard. And when we do, go to the 3rd slide and let us know what is within your mobility hub that you could take that switch from using a personal vehicle to using some other form of transportation. And I'm going to stop screen sharing for a moment so I can put that link in the chat for anybody who needs it again, since it has been a while. There you go. It's in the chat if you need. I'll put a few things of mine. I have a grocery store. I have restaurants. I have friends. What else? I have Ace Hardware store. I have a gym with a pool. Very important in the summertime. I even have the hop shop to hang out, all within my workplace. But I also have that privilege of being able to choose where I did, and I chose it largely on my access for all of these things, to be able to be without a car. And I think somebody mentioned that early on, is that is an equity issue, is a lot of these neighborhoods don't have access to all of these amenities. This is awesome. Is anybody struggling with maybe one or two of their things that they're not sure of, or within the mobility hub, or how to choose alternative transportation to access? I know one thing I have to do is I have to make choices. Which grocery stores do I want to go to? I'd love to go to Food Conspiracy Co-op more often, but it's rare that I'm in the downtown 4th Avenue area, and it's outside of my 3 to 4 mile radius. So it doesn't mean I can't get there. It just means I get there less frequently. And then if I do have to, hey, I'm going downtown, I'd love to stop at the Food Conspiracy Co-op. So I bring in an extra bag, make sure I have some space to get those few things that I really like getting there. There are certain stores, there's an Ace Hardware that's closer to me, that's along Country Club and is not accessible. There's no sidewalk, there's no bike lane. So I choose an Ace Hardware that's a half mile further, but in the opposite direction. And because it is accessible by biking. So I found that when I shifted from not using a car, I make choices. Where do I go? So then this is my case for when I teach this to scale up local first Arizona businesses, is choose your business location carefully, because it's going to dramatically shift who you're going to attract or who you're going to exclude. Great. I think, Stuart, you wanted to take a quick break. Is this a good time?
Yeah, this would be a great time for a 5-minute break.
Okay.
Thank you,
Thank you all.
Kat.
And feel free to continue to contribute if you feel inspired to the Jamboree.
Okay. See you at 11:03.
you all. Are we ready to get going, or should I wait another moment?
I think everybody's here now, so.
All right, are we ready? Start moving? So this is a new section. Well, what about electric vehicles? I didn't used to include this, but I'd get so many questions about electric vehicles. I'm like, yeah, I should. I know it's part of, it's a tool in the toolbox. So let's talk about it. Let's dive in. There we go. So this is my initial thought about electric vehicles. Any responses?
Looks about right.
So
It's the
we're
same
just
thing.
trading one problem for another problem.
Yeah.
I mean, maybe we have less local air pollution, but we're still, I'll get into the other issues, but we still have the cars on the road. We still have congestion. We still have yada, yada. And you could do this with autonomous vehicles, as we still have the same problem. So do want people to know that there are incentives such as, like going solar, going with electric vehicles comes with a range of federal, Arizona, and even some local incentive programs to help. And everything from an incentive for getting an electric vehicle or an incentive for putting in electric vehicle charging at your place of business or organization. But really what drives, my line of thinking is what are the things we have to consider if we want to choose an electric vehicle? And actually, I was kind of happy that I was forced to do this for another presentation, in that I had been long thinking, oh, maybe it's 5 years without a car. Maybe we should get an electric vehicle now that, there's a few more on the market. They're not as costly. We can maybe find one more affordable. So this kind of helped me think through, is it the right time to invest in an electric vehicle? So a few things to think about: energy source. Are you charging it by daytime so you can use solar energy, or using nighttime where it's coming off the grid, so coal, gas? Are you charging during peak versus non-peak hours? Because that's going to really determine your cost for fueling that vehicle. The vehicle efficiency. So instead of miles per gallon, it's kilowatt hours per mile. So we do have to kind of get used to this new metric that we're looking at. And then life cycle costs. This was brought up earlier in the presentation, but what is the embodied energy to produce that vehicle? And then what are the disposal costs for especially the batteries? So we're seeing a lot of mines go in to mine the rare earth minerals that are needed for these special batteries. And so there's a land degradation. There's also an environmental justice component to that, for where are those mines? Where are they being located? But then what are we doing with those batteries after they reach their useful life? And then the last point I think is the most important for me is equity. All right, so if sustainable, or if electric vehicles are the solution, they're pretty costly. So who's going to be able to afford to switch to one? So I often then, there's a few articles out there on if we all choose electric vehicles right now, can our power grids cope with this? And when does it make sense? And this was interesting that when it comes to whether or not electric vehicles are better than fossil fuel cars, the break even is when the power grid is producing 700 grams of carbon dioxide per kilowatt hour. And I'm like, oh, that doesn't mean much to me. But to put that into perspective, we're currently about 1 kilogram per kilowatt hour. So thinking about this, well, let's take this locally. So this is Tucson Electric Power's their 2020 integrated resource plan. And so they have by year their portfolio and reliance on certain fueling sources to power the grid, and then how much grid power generation it is. So thinking about where we are here in 2021, we're still using predominantly coal and natural gas to fuel our power grid. We have very little in renewables. And so we're looking at, we're well above 60% is coming from coal and natural gas. So does that make sense to switch to an electric vehicle? We're just switching a fueling source, one carbon-based source to another carbon-based source. So then the last tool I found that was really helpful, and this is the website, and I'll share all these slides with Stuart and Kevin to share with you all, is down here at the bottom. And you can choose which cars you want to compare. And it's a vehicle cost calculator. It's not a life cycle cost. So it doesn't look at the embodied energy for producing or disposing of the car, but it looks at the lifetime of you owning the car. And so I used to own I forget if it was a 1998 Nissan Sentra. So I was like, oh, I'm going to compare. They had a 2020 Nissan Sentra to a Nissan Leaf, so electric vehicle to a gasoline. And we look at, generally, it is cheaper to run that electric vehicle compared to the gas. But if we do look at it over its entire life, that electric vehicle comes at a much higher cost. And so even through the life of that vehicle, we're not overcoming that. However, if we add in the local, state, and federal incentives, we may be able to make up that gap. And then the other thing I found is, this is my comment earlier, is to make it worthwhile, you have to run this car into the ground. So me using this car once a week for a road trip, it doesn't really make sense. I'm never going to overcome that life cycle cost. And then there's a few other things, TEP provides for like charging stations and such. I'm not really interested in getting into all of that, but just kind of thinking about the infrastructure that then is required to supply those electric vehicles. And we're still building up that infrastructure, but then, there's a lot of, are we really there yet or not? So that's my brief 5 slides on electric vehicles. I didn't want to give it too much in the airwaves, as I think we still have a lot of work to do. It's kind of like energy, thinking about if you're wanting to go with solar energy for your house, have you explored all of the conservation options available to you before you then invest in that solar power? So that is really important, because you could, maybe you would require 20 solar panels right now to supply your home. But as soon as you just start switching out some light bulbs, changing some behaviors, doing some insulation, weatherization, maybe you could get that down to 10 solar panels. So then it's cheaper to invest in that. And I see that issue with electric vehicles. Everybody's like, oh, let's just switch to an electric vehicle. And they forget about all of the other options available to them before they make that choice. Kim, I see your hand is raised.
Yeah, you were talking briefly about the mining that's involved in getting the rare earths for electric vehicles. What are those actual rare earths that are involved in making an electric vehicle? And what happens to these vehicles, like when we don't want them anymore and they wind up in a landfill or something? Is there, environmental problems with that? Like, as far as hazardous waste materials that are involved, and, compare that to like a regular gas-powered vehicle? Great question.
I think that may need a follow-up whole session dedicated to that, as there's a lot packed into there, from the rare earths, the mining, the waste, the disposal. And it's not something I'm ready to get into today, but I think that would be a great research topic to then bring back to this group. I could just gloss over it, but it wouldn't do it justice. But great question. Sorry, Kim.
That's okay.
I'm gonna take a pass on that one.
Yeah, and I mean, and the same thing with solar panels, because I've heard that there's stuff that goes in the manufacturing of solar panels, which isn't all so great either. And what we do with all these old solar panels, if everybody's switching to solar panels, how they break down and how that impacts the environment. There's a lot of stuff there too.
Yeah, and that's why I think energy to water to transportation, we need to look at what are these low-hanging fruit alternatives, and let's invest in those before we take on these other issues. Real quickly, I see Trace and then Kevin, and then I'd like to just wrap up with the final slides so we can open up to full discussion.
I'd just like to second what you're suggesting, Catlow. We need to reduce the amount of travel demand as much as possible, and only then figure out which gadget to use, because there are extremely high costs to everything we do to drive billions of miles a year. So the road costs and everything else are the same.
Yep.
And
Thanks, Trace.
The environmental impacts of billions of miles of driving, however you do it, is still high. So reduce first.
Thanks, Kevin.
I also agree with your approach to the issue. I think there's obviously a lot of environmental groups are really pushing this electrify everything sort of strategy. And I understand where they're coming from. They're also putting pressure on the utilities to decarbonize. So I think as you decarbonize, the electric field benefits will grow. But I think that we've got a very short window that's shrinking to deal with climate change. We've got to do some serious stuff in the next 20, 30 years. And so I think I understand kind of where the environmentalists are coming from. I think for the issues with smart growth and so on, those are pretty tricky at the local level. Those tend to be local level issues, issues you deal with at the municipal or county level. So I think you have to kind of weigh I think you need to, I agree, we need to get cars off the road, reduce car trips, no doubt about it. We should be constantly focusing on that. But I think we're in a race right now to avoid the worst impacts of climate change. So I think there's kind of a balancing act there when it comes to electric vehicles. I understand it. And I did have I visited 3 car manufacturing plants back in the 90s, and now they're switching more to water-based paints and coatings, but they generate a lot of hazardous waste too, and solvents and stuff like that need to be properly handled. So you're right about the life cycle. It's a tricky thing, and I've seen a lot of different life cycle cost analysis, and you really have to look at the assumptions and make sure they're covering all the bases.
Yeah, no, thanks for sharing, Kevin. I want to just spend my last few slides on focusing on things that you can do or things you can ask your workplace, or if you're in charge of your workplace, do at your workplace. And then kind of leave it off, what are some even advocacy options that you have available to yourself? So I always like to do, especially with our staff, is creating an individual action plan. And so my wife and I thrive on challenges, and we don't really take that level of investment required unless we challenge ourselves. And so I like to challenge all of you as a cohort. Maybe you have a cohort challenge, and this is what we did with our interns docents. Is you often need peer support. It's like New Year's resolutions. You just create those yourself. Nobody's holding you accountable but yourself. But if you create them with a group, then others can help you hold yourself accountable, and that really helps, as well as not just accountability, but then support. So what are some alternative transportation goals that you might have this year? So thinking about biking, do you want to do more of those mobility hub trips by bike, or by public transit, or by walking? And then thinking about, once you set those goals, what are the barriers you're going to have to achieve those goals? So maybe biking, you need to invest in a flat maintenance repair kit, or maybe you take a bike maintenance workshop so you get more familiar with how to tune up your bike. Learning how to use public transit, becoming familiar with it, not being intimidated by it. walking, allocating more time to allow for that walk, but then building it into maybe your daily workout routine. So then what are the personal actions you'd have to take to overcome those barriers, and what support do you need to achieve those goals? This is all embedded in that individual action plan. So thinking, we can't just stop at making these goals. We have to think about what are the steps and actions that will support our ability to achieve these goals and be successful. And maybe it's something small. It doesn't have to be an overwhelming goal. I want to just put this on pause. We'll come back to this, but for Jamboard 4, we're going to come back to that just in the interest of time. Thinking about what businesses can do to utilize public transit. So this is, it's a lot about individual action, but then collective action and scaling that up to businesses, to larger employers, to then the city, to then the county, to the state, to the federal levels. So what can businesses do? So address employee needs, maybe offer flexible work schedules, conduct annual surveys, help them through changing habits, creating goals, identifying barriers, overcoming those, providing transit passes to then, as I did with our docents and interns, taking them on a ride to helping them feel comfortable, or mapping out what options there might be for them. If you're here in Tucson, installing bike racks. So the city of Tucson provides free bike racks to businesses. So there's no excuse for a business not to have a bike rack. Reviewing dress code. Who wants to wear a suit and tie in the summer and ride a bike, right? So we need to ensure that we have flexible dress codes, or we provide changing rooms, showers. My wife likes to do walking meetings. So taking people out and getting out of the office and walking, or having a walking meeting on the way to another meeting. Then there may be options with healthcare insurance providers to then, as I mentioned already, taking a class by Bicus, or offering that to a set of staff or employees, to offering loaner bikes. We do this when we conduct our classes. We always have loaner bikes on hand. I noticed somebody asked about e-bikes. I'm not against e-bikes. I struggle with e-bikes from just a recreational basis, but from a commuting basis, it can really make, I've seen a lot of people that would never ride because of physical disabilities hop on an e-bike, and now they can do grocery shopping. So if it's providing that level of accessibility, I'm all for it. I actually own an e-assist cargo bike, and it's made the difference. I have no excuse not to take my bike now. For grocery shopping, picking up 50 pounds of chicken feed, to transporting a friend. I'm like, I got this bike. Why would I choose to drive? It's so much fun to use the bike. So there are places for it. It does have a battery, it does have a cost. What can businesses do to change employee habits? So this is where coming in, creating team challenges. So it's 66 days to form a new habit. So just don't create a 1 week or a 1 month challenge. Make it a seasonal challenge, and then check in periodically. And so then we also have incentive benefit programs, considering carefully how to provide disincentives, but making sure that you're being careful of potential equity issues, knowing that we want to make it accessible for everybody. Shared parking, especially churches and schools. You know, there's times that those parking lots are maxed out. There's 90% of the time they're not being used. So are there nearby businesses that could potentially use those spaces? So then they don't have to have as much parking. Choosing business location, offering employee choice. But I like to simplify it into 5 quick things. Walk the talk. Invite and introduce someone to an alternative mode of transportation. So that's the best form, peer-to-peer exchange, peer-to-peer awareness, peer-to-peer interest. Developing, so that leads to the 3rd, developing a fun peer-to-peer challenge. Don't be judgmental. Everybody's starting in a different place. Everybody has different needs, but thinking about a fun challenge that rewards them for shifting behavior. And then be familiar with basic bike needs. So Bicus, public transit options. So getting familiar yourself so you can be a better advocate, or be familiar so you can advocate for what needs to change and coming from a place of experience. And then that leads to the fifth is advocate, advocate, advocate. Our elected leaders, our decision makers need to hear from you. And actually, November 23rd, the mayor and councils in their regular session, will be approving the Move Tucson and the Complete Streets Design Guide. So that's a chance to advocate for fare free public transit, advocate for safer, more complete streets, advocate for the need for separated bike paths, etc. And then lastly, we got to leave with some humor, right? So we may be approaching our time. How are we doing with time, Stuart or Kevin?
Well, Catlow, I thought you had as one more exercise you wanted us to do. Is that true?
If time permits, yes.
I would say when we have a guest speaker, we like to let them complete with integrity. So whatever we've got after, we'll adjust accordingly.
Oh, okay. That's very kind of you. Maybe we can keep it to 5 minutes or so.
Let's see what happens.
So my last slide is slide 4 on the Jamboard. If anybody needs the link, I can reshare it. But I have just kind of thinking, what are sustainable transportation goals do you want to set this year? And then what support do you need? And so maybe as cohorts can help each other, because I won't be interfacing with you as regularly.
Would these be personal goals or sort of advocacy goals? Like what do we want to advocate for? Or is all those things?
I always like to make it a personal goal that of either a choice in sustainable transportation or an advocacy for sustainable transportation, or both, because I do a bit of both.
Okay.
And I find it works best with the sticky note option. So there's a sticky note here that works well. And I'll stop screen sharing and let you all start filling that out. And if there's questions along the way, I'd be happy to take them for the next maybe 5 minutes, if that's as you fill that out.
Well, I've got a question real quick. You mentioned that the city provides free bike locks, like those bike racks.
Bike racks.
The bike racks. How do we request that? Like, I've got a business that could use some of those. How do I go about getting that?
The Department of Transportation and Mobility offers that through their bike program. And I used to know the contact. I'll try to think of his name. I think if you just call their general number and ask, for their bike program for free bike racks, they'll probably direct you to that.
Okay. Is it the Department of Transportation and Mobility?
It is. If they're within the city of Tucson.
Yeah, perfect. Thank you.
Is his name Bell?
No.
Okay.
Unless it's somebody new. It's been over a year since I've interacted with that person. I just had a staff member take the Bicus maintenance class, and it made it really bike travel accessible for him. He was struggling with keeping his bike in working order to regularly commute to work. And he did actually just give up his car. So I was really proud of him, and really proud that he stepped up to take that maintenance class. And so I definitely recommend that.
I've taken that class as well, and it's really good. And they even fixed my spoke while I was there because I broke a spoke on the way.
That's awesome. Yeah, I found that e-assist bike is really helpful for commuting to summertime meetings. I often choose the bus, but if I can't, that's when the e-assist, so I don't show up a sweaty mess. Yeah, find a friend, find a peer, and do a challenge with them. Make it fun. maybe you bike, if you have a regular get together, choose a biking or a busing destination and go together. Oh, thanks for posting the bike rack website. Yeah, I would suggest somebody posted financial freedom for purchasing a bike. Bicus again is an amazing resource. I believe when we first moved to Tucson, my wife got her first commuter at Bicus, and it was at that time I think $20. I think now they have build a bike for maybe $100. So there is a cost to it, but you can find really less expensive options there. And somebody's at a loss, I'm not able to bike, I'm able to walk some distance. I would not be able to carry things like groceries and probably wouldn't be able to pull a cart. Nearest public transportation is, oh, maybe it didn't get completed. I'm not sure how to get the rest of it. Yeah, and I think this is a struggle, as we may not be able to, but this is where then how can we advocate to make it accessible for you? So if you currently don't have these options, what would allow or enable you to have those options? And then who do you advocate to? Is it your ward office? Is your supervisor? Is it Department of Transportation? Maybe there's something with ADA accessibility for sidewalks and such, just to be able to get to the bus stop. Use my bike 5 times a week. I love these goals. You're inspiring me. I'm trying to get to use the bus more. I usually use it for work-related meetings, but since those aren't happening, traveling less for work meetings, I'm trying to find ways to use it more in my personal errands. Well, thank you all. I don't want to take up too much more of your time, Stuart and Kevin.
Well, thank you, Kevin. Let's see, does Kim, do you still have a question? Kim's hand was up, but maybe that was from a previous moment.
Nope, sorry, gotta lower my hand, sorry.
Okay, Kevin, what would you like to summarize?
I don't know if I want to summarize. I don't think I'm qualified, but I do want to say that I thought of all the ideas, and there are many good ideas that you suggested. I think I like the idea of getting the business community involved in the process more, providing incentives and education and suggestions to their employees. And I was thinking, if I was the mayor, I'd see if I could round up 50 to 100 businesses that would want to participate in a Curb Your Car Week challenge every year to start, because I think it's, to some extent, it's going to have to come up from the ground up to make people more comfortable looking at smarter mobility choices. And I think that maybe one of the better ways to do that is through working with the business community and seeing if they would be willing to set goals. 5-10% of my increase in my employees will avail themselves of an alternative transportation measure for X number of days a week or X number of days a month or whatever. But I think that I just don't know. I think there's opportunities there, and I think we could learn from other communities are doing to promote bicycling through the businesses, local businesses.
Yeah, and I do talk a lot about biking, but I think the most important thing is busing. Right now we have fare free, and mayor and council will soon be deciding on if that continues into next year or not. And I think it's a huge equity issue, being able to offer fare free, but it's also a huge, just the potential loss of ridership by worrying if you have the right change or not. I think it just increases the accessibility for the entire community. So we can start to drive up ridership of the bus system. And so then thinking about which employers, you know, who's going to support the fare free. And so I like your idea, Kevin, of rounding up the 50 large employers, and maybe we round up to also get them to support employee-based programs to subsidize or support the bus system.
I do think we have to think about in what ways we want to promote bus use. It's by policy, the operational costs are covered 20% by fare box and 80% by local taxpayers. And the fare doesn't cover any capital costs for the bus. So you only pay less than a fifth of the actual cost of taking the bus.
So what do you think about the viability of taking even that less than 20% out of the income stream? It sounds like, Catlow, you're thinking that getting businesses to somehow pitch in, or are we talking about raising taxes? It's one nice thing about the fare free is you can just jump on and off the bus, and it's faster that way.
Yeah, I think it's a similar issue to we were promoting green infrastructure for so many years and putting in so many demonstrations and projects, but nobody was dedicating long-term maintenance and care for these systems. And so many were failing. And so I think that's where we can look at local funding sources, you know, be creative in how we fund. So we figured that out partly. We do need to grow the green infrastructure stormwater fund program. But I think it's the same with the buses. What's the vision for a community? Where do we want to go? And then what's it going to take to get there? And if we want less cars on the road, you know, it's a cost. So nobody's considering what is the opportunity cost of all these cars on the road. So let's shift that to how do we decrease that? So bus is one, bikes are another. Changing land use neighborhoods is another. Some are shorter term, some are longer term, but I think we need to start putting our resources, you know, investing in these systems. And it's going to take some creative thought. I don't have the solution on that, but I know in other communities, large major employers often subsidize the bus system, or it can be, you know, resident landowner funded. There's a number of options. And it's actually not that much of an increase to what we already subsidized the bus system to. And I think there was even a study of what was the cost of the fare collection system compared to the amount of revenue it actually provides, and it was fairly minimal.
In other words, you're saying that the cost of collecting pretty much amortized the benefit of the collecting.
There was a very small net profit, I think, is what I remembered from that study. Because there's so much embedded cost to just create a fare collection system.
Now, one could say we've got the system created, so that cost has been invested already. So do we want to continue collecting fare to amortize that cost?
Yeah, but then you have longer wait times to get on the bus because waiting for everybody to pay versus just rapidly boarding.
Yeah, it's a much better rider experience, there's no question.
Definitely, yeah. Even in the midst of COVID.
My thought had been we were going to talk about applications of what you shared with us today, entries, to somehow do some integrative thinking in little breakout rooms. And I think we're starting to have that conversation. And Catlow, do you want to just stick around and field 10 more minutes of eliciting ideas from all of us? There's a few voices that have been in the room, but not all of us. Or would you like me to do that?
I was gonna, if you want to facilitate, Stuart, I was struggling to keep track of who all was participating, so maybe you have a better idea than I.
Well, okay, this is just flying by the seat of one's pants. But I think that it would be really neat if we all, can you make a new whiteboard for us, a new page?
There is no slide 5.
Okay, so then I think, why don't we all just write either by hand? Right. So Jack says no breakout rooms, good idea. How about if we just take a minute to think about these ideas that have been put forward so far, and what really might we do as individuals and or as a group, so we can actually get something from this conversation with Catlow and with Trace. Do we all want to write a letter to our mayor and council, for example, regarding the Move Tucson plan? Or what about Kevin's idea for the 50 businesses to do a Curb Your Car week? Okay, so Catlow's putting some things in the chat.
Oh, sorry, these are just items I mentioned prior that I thought
Okay.
it would be helpful if I put in the chat. Sorry to interrupt.
I think it would be interesting if we each put our voice in the room, those of us who can. It's great to hear everyone's voice. So community villages, wonderful way to increase density. Yeah, definitely reduce the heat island. Noting the synergy of the community village idea that Trace has been speaking about, and then all of these particulars that Catlow has brought out.
I would think that I would say that the idea of my urban villages does not increase density. Density is not an issue when it comes to the amount of travel we do, only the mode of travel. And if you create concentrations of destinations, so everybody lives near a lot of things they want to get to, then you don't have to travel as far. But the first step to making all that happen is to make your neighborhood great. Because if people aren't willing to get out and walk or bike for any purpose, then they won't go someplace nearby. So planting lots of trees, turning your neighborhood into a park called Wohnhöfe or home zones in Europe, doing things like that is the first key step to developing a mobility diet.
So what you're saying, Trace, is the mobility diet could begin with improving the quality of our neighborhood infrastructure, whether it's trees or traffic calming or more amenities. That's really, that would be a very strategic place to begin, is what you're saying.
I think that's actually the first step, because if the first thing you do when you walk out the front door is get in your car, we failed. It's how do you get people to not use the car from the beginning? And having a great neighborhood is probably the first start on that.
Well, I see something, I can link to that. I've lived in Paris more than I have in the United States. I'm in Tucson now, but I've been in Paris since the 16th of September. And one thing that there's 20 arrondissements in Paris, and each one of those is a community village. And that is what I've really been thinking about so much, because that was the thing I valued the most. The loveliness of everyday life, where everything you had to do, everything could be done mostly on foot, and you'd see all your neighbors while you're shopping and everything. And then if you had to go a little bit further, well, there's just this incredible bus network and subway network, which is a real paradox because so many people crowd the streets with their cars too. So I mean, it's not without issues, this city, but really, you know, the notion of a village, and especially Montmartre where I live, it's very much a village. And that's what I've, you know, and I was gone for 2 years because of COVID. And so this is what I've been reinvigorating in my understanding of everyday life is, you know, the same butcher, the same pharmacist that I've had for years, and going back and seeing all these people and start transacting with them again. So I totally agree with that. But, you know, the choices we made in America were around cars, whereas they didn't make those choices in Paris. So, I mean, it's easy to say, but it's something that I think we could start doing. And I feel in Sam Hughes, we have done, there's a lot of those possibilities, which is why I moved there when I came back to the States. About
Fascinating experience. And Kim, you were going to say something too, I think. Wow, we've got, and I hope everyone can see the chat.
Well, I think, you know, like Kevin's working on some proposals, you know, of things that can be done suggested by Sustainable Tucson as a group. And I think that's just important to include some of these ideas. And I think we should, you know, what is Sustainable Tucson if it's not a vehicle for trying to affect change, you know, at least in a local level, you know, like putting the pressure on our city and city council, our mayor, our board of supervisors. It should be like a big advocacy group that does put informed ideas out there. Hopefully, isn't that what we're striving for?
Definitely, it's our goal. And it's so interesting. Kevin, you know, came in from another systemic angle, which is let's put a restriction on how far we spread. That I think that has to do with, Joanna Macy talks about, if you want to improve the state of the world, you can stop the harm and then you can repair the harm. And then you also need to be changing systems thinking. And then you need to, of course, change your consciousness about what it means to live on this planet as a sentient being with billions of others, not to mention the other creatures. So stopping the harm is not the only thing to do, but we don't want to leave it out. Is that a fair representation, Kevin? You're saying let's at least stop doing more of the harm. Can we do that?
It would be a huge, huge lift. You know, it's, you know, there over the last 50 years, there have been some initiatives in communities to try to put a growth boundary in place, but it's huge amount of opposition from, you know, the home builders and the real estate folks and, you know, and others. But I you know, I'd have to go back and look and see how things are working in Portland and a few other communities. But it's just a lot of resources would have to be focused. And the question was, should I focus all these resources on this issue? Knowing that it's the chances are not going to be great that this, you know, the local governments would agree to something like that. Or do I put those resources into some other stuff that might be more doable?
And switching topics though, just watching the clock though, Jessica's commented, traveling by bike with my kids. Do you mean your students or your children, Jessica?
I mean my own children.
And right. So it sounds as though this is another systemic thing that I think both Trace and Catlow have talked about, which is making sure you've really got safe places to ride your bikes. And that seems like something that's a doable advocacy piece. Catlow, does Move Tucson accommodate this need?
Yeah, so the Complete Streets Design Guide, which was just finalized and is going before Mayor and Council for adoption, does have basically builds in how to make it safer for pedestrians and bikes to move along our roadways and have these roadways not be designed just for cars, but for shared and other modes of transportation at the same time. And so there is a lot more for protective spaces, protective lanes.
The two designs I've seen here are, one is like along St. Mary's Road where they've actually got those little, I don't know what you call those stand-up things to separate the cars from the bikes. And another one, actually three designs. Then somewhere I think on around Main Street where there's the bike is actually in it's a protected lane. There's sort of a curb between the bikes and the cars, just for a little block there on stone or something.
Mm-hmm.
And Mountain is an example where there's a wide marked bike lane, and that feels like the safest actually, because there's so much room. Are those the kinds of designs, or there's others?
And there's a few others they're looking at. So I think for the first time ever, well, so the Prop 407 is investing a lot in greenways, bikeways, and so 6th Avenue is looking at gaining a protected bike lane for a section of it. But for the first time ever, one of the major RTA projects will not be going forward for a road widening expansion, and this is 1st Avenue. That the decision was made to keep it a 4-lane roadway, but to enhance bike and pedestrian safety rather than increasing additional travel lane in each direction. So I think that's a huge win. I think our community is starting to shift in what we're prioritizing, what we're investing in. It's going to be slow. I mean, transportation plans take 20 years to roll out, and even then are met with a lot of delays or being underfunded.
I just want to say that I'm really excited about this Move Tucson. I want to learn more about it, and I definitely want to show up in November. I think that's really exciting. And I think also, I feel really hopeful for Tucson. I guess I just want to share that because, so we're from Seattle, and one of the things that drew us here was that there was the loop around the whole city, and not all cities get that. That's a huge plus, and really drew us here. And something that I think is so cool here is that I feel like really average Joe people are on their bikes. In Seattle, there was a really intimidating kind of bike culture. It seemed like if you were a biker, you wore Lycra and you had a really expensive bike. And something I see here is that people are biking on all kinds of bikes, old bikes, new bikes. They're biking in jeans, they're biking in t-shirts, you know, they're just really kind of the average Joe sort of person biking, and
biking with a 24-pack of Keystone Light
and their
off
dog.
of one handlebar.
Yeah, I mean,
along Speedway.
Yeah,
the Tucson bikers are so resilient.
They're really resilient here, and we don't have things like snow that are really difficult. We do have heat, but Jacqueline bikes in all seasons, and she says that she thinks why so many people bike, even just like the average Joe person, not just like hardcore bikers, is because you get some wind when you're
cooler
biking
than walking.
Yeah.
Bike.
So yeah, I feel really hopeful. I feel really hopeful, and we'll definitely be there in November. Yeah, for the Move Tucson. Yeah.
Great. Wonderful enthusiasm, I think, that we're all feeling. And I think we can thank both Trace and Catlow for that. Trace by giving us this big picture of costs that are involved in transportation and this central idea of the mobility, starting with the urban village, and then Catlow with so many delightful exercises to get us talking and thinking together, and a lot of fun pictures, a lot of practical ideas. So thank you both, Trace and Catlow. What we'll do now is just take a few minutes for announcements. And Catlow, did you have a last comment you'd like to share before you go, or good?
No, thank you all for your time, your interest, and your advocacy and taking action. It was a pleasure.
Well, you've lit a fire, and we'll let it burn slow and long. Okay. So we have some announcements. And the first one, I'd like to ask Kevin to briefly tell us about the climate advocacy. He's going to show something on the screen. Isla, you're invited to say something about our walks coming up. And let's see, I was going to ask Rocky, she cut out before, she could tell us about the Repair Cafe. Steve is not here today, so maybe Kevin, that'll go to you also. So Kevin, we're ready for climate advocacy. Looks like you're going to share screen. And Trace, you could probably cut the video at this point if you'd like.